Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Are there not enough seats? There's a seat up here if anybody needs. It's a little disorienting to come into a new environment, like switching over from a Windows to a Macintosh. Okay, so today we start with the sutta. It's called the Alagaddupama Sutta. This is the simile of the snake. And this is Sutta number 22 in the Majjhima Nikaya, beginning on page 224. And this sutta will reveal to us something of a, you might say, another side to the Buddha. Like, often you think the Buddha is just a jolly guy with smiles, a smiley face, a big hug, with a lot of love and compassion for everybody. But sometimes the Buddha can be very strict, even stern, especially when his teaching is being misrepresented. And we see that that would be the case in this discourse. Okay, so the sutta begins when a certain monk whose name is Arittha, he doesn't figure elsewhere in the text, to my knowledge, begins to spread what is called a pernicious view, or a wrong view. Thus, he says, as I understand the Dharma taught by the Blessed One, those things called obstructions by the Blessed One are not able to obstruct one who engages in them. And this statement by this monk named Arita is actually a direct contradiction to what the Buddha himself says, since the Buddha has pointed out that certain things or certain activities are obstructions, that is, obstructions to the fulfillment of the spiritual life, to the attainment of awakening or liberation. And here, Arita is saying that these are not obstructions, that they're not able to obstruct one who engages in them. And in Sutta number 12 in the Majjhima Nikaya, this is the greater discourse on the lion's roar, the Buddha speaks about what are called the four, sometimes translated the four kinds of intrepidity, or maybe more simply, the four kinds of certainty that the Buddha has regarding his teaching. For those who have the whole book, this is on page 167. And it's in paragraph 25. He says, I see no ground on which any recluse or Brahmin or anybody at all could accuse me thus those things called obstructions by you are not able to obstruct one who engages in them. So this is the third ground of intrepidity, or third ground of certainty that belongs to Buddha, or the Tathagata. And so this monk named Arita is directly rejecting, or explicitly rejecting, that ground of certainty, that ground of self-confidence of the Buddha. And the Pali version of this sutta, it's a little bit indirect or implicit when it speaks just very generally about those things called obstructions by the Blessed One. But there is a Chinese counterpart to the sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, Zhongna Anjing. It's sutta number 200 in that collection. And it states quite explicitly that the monk Arittha is proclaiming that the indulgence in sensual pleasures is not able to obstruct one who indulges in them. Okay, so now as Arittha is going around explaining his understanding of the Dhamma, then some of the other monks hear about this, and then they call him for questioning. They ask him, is it true that such a view has arisen in you? And then Arittha answers, it is exactly so, friends. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, those things called obstructions by the Blessed One are not able to obstruct one who engages in them. Actually, if you were reading this text in the Pali, then when you come to paragraph 3, when the monks question Arittha, they say, friend Arittha, is it true that such a pernicious view as this has arisen in you, that as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, those things called obstructions by the Blessed One are not able to obstruct one who engages in them? And then when Arittha replies and says, yes, it is exactly so, he repeats that. So if you ever think you're in danger of forgetting that statement, all you have to do is read the sutta in the original and you'll have it pounded into your head about 10 times. Okay, so when Arittha replies in this way, then the monks try to convince him that he's wrong. And so they press him, question him, cross-question him, and then they say, do not speak thus, friend Arittha, do not misrepresent the Buddha. It's not good to misrepresent the Blessed One. For the Blessed One would not speak thus, for in many ways the Blessed One has stated how obstructive things are obstructions, and how they are able to obstruct one who engages in them. And now at this point, the monks make it explicit what Arittha was actually teaching. Because they go on to say, the Blessed One has stated that sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering and despair, and that the danger in them is still more. And then they bring in these similes. Some of them seem a little bit on the severe side. Okay, with the simile of the skeleton, with the simile of the piece of meat, the simile of the grass torch, the simile of the pit of coals, the simile of the dream, the simile of borrowed goods, the simile of fruits on a tree, the simile of the butcher's knife and block, the simile of the sword stake, the simile of the snake's head. The Buddha has stated that sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering and despair, and that the danger in them is still more. Then if one wants to find what is being indicated by these similes, one finds these similes treated explicitly in Sutta number 54 of the Majjhima Nikaya. We start on page 469. You have the full book on paragraph 15. I won't read the whole simile, but I'll just sort of recapitulate or summarize what's indicated in each simile. Okay, the simile of what is called the skeleton, it's actually a chain of bones without meat, smeared by blood. And the simile is that of a butcher who takes a chain of bones after cutting off the meat and throws it outdoors for a dog. And then the dog goes running after the chain of bones, hoping to get a meal out of it. But all he could get are a little few scraps of meat and lick the bones, and that's all. No real satisfaction. Okay, the next one is the simile of a piece of meat. Okay, this is the case where there's a piece of meat maybe lying on a street, and then a bird, like a vulture or a hawk, descends on it and picks it up and flies away. And then other birds, other hawks or other vultures come flying after him, attacking him and clawing at him and pecking at him, trying to pull that piece of meat away from him. And so when one goes seeking after sensual pleasures, maybe one gets a little pleasure as one is enjoying it, but other people are competing with you for the same pleasure, and then creating trouble for you, injuring you, attacking you, sometimes even killing you. And so that is the danger in sensual pleasure. Okay, the third simile is that of the blazing grass torch. Okay, so this is the case of somebody who picks up the torch thinking to get light out of it, and he walks with it against the wind, and the wind is blowing in the opposite direction and blows the flames towards his hand, towards his face, and he gets burnt. The next is the pit of burning coals. Okay, so there's a pit of burning coals without flame or smoke, and then a man comes along, a man who is intent on living, who wants to be happy, not to suffer. But two strong men grab him by both arms and drag him towards the charcoal pit, and he will struggle and pull and wiggle to try to escape from them. But they keep on pulling him and throw him into the charcoal pit. Then the sensual pleasures are similar to a dream. Okay, this is like a man who falls asleep and he has a dream about beautiful gardens with lovely meadows, lovely flowers. Then he wakes up and he's back to everyday reality. The lovely, well, when I wake up and look out the window, I see a lovely lake, a lovely forest, lovely meadow. But suppose one is living in the city with the elevated subway train going right outside one's window, and down on the street there are people hustling back and forth, buses running, crowds walking back and forth. And so when you wake up and look out the window, all of the beautiful parks, gardens, lakes are gone. Okay, sensual pleasures are like borrowed goods. Okay, this is like a simile of, to put it in modern terms, it might be like a man who goes to one of these rent-a-car services. He rents a very nice, impressive car, and he maybe goes to rent a tuxedo place and puts on a tuxedo. Or is there rented jewelry places? Yeah. They have them now. He rents the jewelry, And so he goes driving through the neighborhood, driving his rented car with the rented jewelry, rented tuxedo, a rented suit, and everybody is looking at him with admiration, some with envy. But then the rent-a-car service calls him up and says, you have to return that car, it's overdue, and pay the fee, pay the late fee. The rented tuxedo place calls him up and says, you have to return the tuxedo and pay the late fee. The rented jewelry place says, calls him and says, you have to return the jewels and pay the fee. And so when he gets finished paying all of these fees, now he's in debt. And nobody is admiring him, nobody is envying him. They're thinking, oh, what a miserable person that is. Oh, how he's gotten himself into so much trouble. And then if he can't pay the debt, then the creditors come and they demand that he be put into prison. Okay, so sense pleasures are like borrowed goods. And like fruits on a tree, okay, here there's a grove or an orchard with fruit trees, and a man comes along with a bag. He wants to pluck the fruits and collect them and take them home. So he climbs up the tree with his bag, starts plucking the fruits, putting them into the bag. But while he's up high in the tree, some other men come along thinking, we need some logs of wood in order to make fire during the winter when it gets cold. Let's choose a tree. This is a good tree. We'll cut it down. And the man is way up high in the tree, and they start cutting. The man is yelling, hey, hey, I'm up in the tree. And the two men say, did you hear something? The other man says, no, it must be your imagination. They go on cutting, 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 and because of the sound of the chopping of the tree, they don't hear the man yelling down, until finally, when the tree is completely cut, it comes tumbling down, and the man who is on top of the tree collecting the fruits falls down and gets injured. Okay, so those are the main similes, and the simile of the butcher's knife and the block, simile of the sword stake, simile of the snake's head. I don't think that they're in this sutta. Number 54. Yeah, but basically you could interpret them along the same lines. Okay, so the monks are here drawing upon these similes and trying to convince monk Arittha to give up his view. And finally, they could not succeed in convincing him. So finally, they decide to report this to the Buddha. And so they go to the Buddha, they report what has been taking place. The Buddha then asks the monk to call Arittha. Arittha comes to the Buddha's presence. And then remember, this is the way the Buddha, when he wants to criticize somebody, as I pointed out, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? He doesn't immediately pick up on the reports that others make about a case of misconduct. But before the Buddha will reproach somebody, he first will ask the person who is being criticized whether the reports that are being spread about him are true. So he wants the person to admit on his own that there's some validity to those reports. So he says, is it true that you have been spreading this pernicious view, as I, again, repeats the same thing, as I understand the Dharma taught by the Blessed One, those things that the Blessed One calls obstructions are not able to obstruct one who engages in them. Arita admits this, and then the Buddha criticizes him. And he says, "To whom have you ever known me to teach the Dhamma in that way? Have I not said in many ways how obstructive things are obstructions, and how they are able to obstruct one who engages in them?" And then the Buddha repeats the same thing that the monk said, referring to these similes on sensual pleasures. Okay, at this point I want to explain a little bit about the place of sensual pleasure and sensual desire in the Buddha's teaching. And why is it that the Buddha is criticizing this monk so severely, so sternly, for spreading this view about sensual pleasures? We know that the basic framework for the Buddha's program of liberation is the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths begin with the Noble Truth of suffering. And then the Buddha, in the Second Noble Truth, traces the cause or origin of suffering. And then in the Third Noble Truth, he teaches that to reach the complete end or cessation of suffering, it's necessary to uproot or to eliminate the Second Noble Truth, the cause of suffering. Okay, so the Second Noble Truth teaches the cause of suffering. And what is the cause or origin of suffering? Clinging, of course, is part of the process, but the more fundamental factor.
Attachment. Craving.
Craving is the one that's, the word is usually used. Craving. The Pali word tanha actually, one could see it more clearly in the Sanskrit word. Is related to the English word thirst. So this is the thirst in the sense of a kind of blind, compulsive desire. And then the Buddha, in numbers of suttas, dissects or analyzes craving into three types. And so we have the first is kama tanha, which is the craving for sensual pleasures. The second is bhava tanha, which is the craving for becoming, for continued existence. And then there's vibhava tanha. Say this is the craving for non-existence, or for craving for annihilation. But the one that concerns us here is the craving for sensual pleasures. So this is, we could say, it's probably of the three, it's the most immediate form of craving, the one which is usually functioning most actively in our minds most of the time. And so we're usually compulsively driven to try to find satisfaction through the senses, by indulging the senses in order to experience sensual enjoyment. Then, when the Buddha speaks about the process of developing meditation, he explains that there are 5 hindrances, 5 mental factors that function as hindrances in that they prevent the mind from quieting down and becoming collected and focused and concentrated. In other words, there are 5 obstacles to samadhi, concentration. And these 5 factors are also said to be panya dubala karaniya. That is, they are 5 things which weaken wisdom, 5 things which prevent wisdom from arising and growing stronger. And these 5 things are called the 5 hindrances. And the first of the 5 hindrances is what kind of hindrance? What is its name?
Desire. Sensual desire.
Right, sensual desire. Okay, so that is desire for sensual enjoyment. And so when one sits to meditate, one finds initially that the mind wanders, and usually often what it's wandering to are thoughts, fantasies, images of sensual pleasures. And then because of these images and fantasies, then the desire for these sensual objects floods into the mind and agitates and disturbs the mind. Okay, and so to help his disciples overcome sensual craving and sensual desire, the Buddha taught a gradual process, and he formulated his teaching differently for people in different walks of life, for different lifestyles. And so for his lay disciples, what the Buddha teaches as a kind of primary requisite for leading an ethical life is the 3rd precept, which means to abstain from misconduct in regard to sensual pleasures. And this means specifically to abstain from what is called sexual misconduct. And this has a very specific meaning. It doesn't mean, some people say, like a modern interpretation, that abstaining from sensual misconduct means that one shouldn't enjoy sense pleasures. But that is not really what the Buddha is saying. There's no prohibition on lay people from enjoying ordinary sensual pleasures. It doesn't even mean that for lay people to enjoy sexual pleasures, they have to be in a legal marriage. If 2 mature, independent people want to have a sexual relationship and they're not bound to others who will be hurt, they can do so, and that's not a violation of the 3rd precept. The 3rd precept doesn't require a monogamous relationship. The Buddha was living in a period where kings and princes would have maybe several wives and several concubines, and they became the Buddha's followers. And the Buddha didn't say you should only have one wife, get rid of the others. But what the 3rd precept prohibits is having a sexual relationship that violates a commitment that one has made oneself to another person, or to have a sexual relationship with somebody who is under the protection of another, or who is in a committed relationship to another person. So that would be, I think, correspond to what we call adultery. And it would also mean having sexual relations with minors, or even with people who are over the legal age, but if they're protected, they're under the guardianship of parents, or an older brother, older sister, then they are off bounds, so to speak. So that is the ethical precept that the Buddha has laid down for lay followers as the guidance in everyday life. But then he is sort of steering lay people towards a stronger path of renunciation by teaching on certain occasions during the month, which are called the Uposatha days. These would be, according to the lunar calendar, the full moon day and the new moon day, or the dark moon day. He commends the undertaking of 8 precepts, and in the frame of the 8 precepts, the 3rd precept is changed from abstaining from sexual misconduct to observing celibacy. So at least for this day and night, one is abstaining from any kind of sexual involvement and adopting the lifestyle of a monastic person. Okay, but now when one decides to move from the household life into the monastic life, then one, in principle, makes a commitment to undertake the full training, which is directed towards overcoming the causes of suffering, particularly to overcome craving in all of its forms. But in actual practice, that will mean overcoming the expressions of craving for sense pleasures. And then this is done explicitly by taking up the life of celibacy. And so the Buddha laid it down as a very fixed principle of his teaching, that those who go forth into the homeless life, those who take the initial ordination as well as the full ordination, have to be perfectly committed to observing celibacy. And if one breaks this principle of celibacy, then in effect one breaks one's monastic status. One loses one's monastic status. Okay, so the Buddha was very insistent on the observance of this principle. And now what this Bhikkhu Arita was saying, in effect, is that even though it's expressed very indirectly by way of innuendos and hints in the wording of the text, but what he's really saying is, okay guys, I'll put it a little crudely, okay guys, it doesn't matter that you've shaved your head and that you're wearing ochre-colored robes, but there are some lovely girls in the next town, let's go get them. So he's saying, pretty much saying that even though we're monastics, we're not bound to observe celibacy. We can indulge in sexual activities, and that won't be an obstruction to us. And so by teaching in this way, even by hints and by indirect statements, Arita, this monk Arita, is attempting to overthrow the rule of celibacy that the Buddha has laid down for the monastic order. And so this is why the Buddha is so strict and so stern, even a little bit harsh in his criticism of Arita. So coming back to paragraph 7, he turns to the other monks and he says, has this monk Arita kindled even a spark of wisdom in this Dhamma and discipline? Then the monks say, how could that be? No, that he hasn't. Okay, when they say this, then this is a stock description when somebody is defeated in a discussion or debate. The monk Arita sits there silent, dismayed, his shoulders drooping, his head down, glum, and without response. maybe your son Ben, he knows this from his debating team. He defeats his opponent in debate, then the student sits there silent, dismayed, shoulders drooping, glum, without response. Okay, then the Buddha says, now I'm going to question the monks about this. Okay, so then the Buddha asks the monks whether they understand the Dhamma the way Arita has taught it. And the monks say, again, this gets repetitive, no, Venerable Sir, for in many ways the Blessed One has stated how obstructive things are obstructions, and so forth. Then the Buddha says, good monks, it's good that you understand the Dhamma taught by me thus. He repeats everything. And then he makes a very interesting statement in paragraph 9. He says that one can engage in sensual pleasures without sensual desires, without perceptions of sensual desire, without thoughts of sensual desire. That is impossible. It seems that what Arita might have been saying is that it's possible for us, being monks, we can go out and engage in sensual pleasures, which again, this really means engage in sexual relations without being defiled, hindered, and obstructed by sensual thoughts, by perceptions, that is, perceptions that grasp upon these sensually enticing aspects of form, sound, sense, and so on, and without thoughts of sensual desire. So in other words, Arita seems to be recognizing that perceptions of sensual desire, thoughts of sensual desire, the desires themselves, those are hindrances, those are obstructions. But it's possible to engage in the activity without being hindered by them. Now in the case of food, say eating, there are like two main activities that bring sensual pleasure. One is sexual activity, the other is eating or food. But everybody, at least to my knowledge, has to eat in order to survive. They say that there are some people who are able to live just on air. By breathing the air, they can get all the nutrition they need from the air. I haven't met one yet. And if I were to meet one, I would want to take a little look behind inside the cave where he's living to see whether he has a stash of bananas there. But apart from this rare case, if it's at all possible, everybody else has to eat. And normally, eating will excite, well, if we don't get food for some time or don't get the exact food that we want, then we start thinking about the food that we want. If 2 weeks go by and there's no ice cream served up in the dining hall, then even though I might have very delicious Chinese, vegetarian food, fruits, even cake, but no ice cream, 2 weeks have gone by. I go back to my room, have to write something, thinking ice cream, sit in meditation, in breath, out breath, ice cream, ice cream. But if I reflect, then thoughts about ice cream, thoughts about exciting and delicious food vanish. And then I can eat just by being mindful of eating or reflecting wisely on the food. And I can eat without being tainted by sensual desires. But eating is necessary. But in the case of indulging in sexual pleasure, the Buddha is saying that it's impossible to indulge in sexual activity without having perceptions of sensual desire, without the thoughts of sensual desire, without the desires themselves. And those desires are some aspect of kamatana, the craving for sensual pleasure. Okay, maybe at this point I'll pause and I'll ask whether there are any questions. So please feel, let me just get my glasses. Okay. Nina? Rina? Nina? Nina, okay.
I didn't quite understand how monogamy was not prohibited because...
How monogamy was not?
Prohibited because if there were people that had several wives,
Yeah.
the Buddha didn't think that it was okay. I mean, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You see, the third precept is not an injunction that one has to strictly observe monogamy. Because in the Buddha's time, it was customary for, kings would have several wives, several concubines, maybe princes, members of royalty. Probably the Buddha himself before his renunciation, though the text usually speaks about him becoming married to his wife Yasodhara, but it's said that he lived in 3 palaces, one for each season of the year, and in the palaces he was surrounded by dancing girls, dancing musicians, female musicians. And so I assume that these dancing girls and female musicians, some of them were his concubines. And so monogamy, he didn't make monogamy a requirement, but what is prohibited by the third precept is having sexual relations with somebody in a way that violates either a commitment that you yourself have just made to another person, or a commitment or an obligation that the other person, the partner, has to somebody else. But even though I say this, that the Buddha didn't enforce monogamy, but he still encouraged it with the statement that the ideal is that one should be content with one's own wife.
Thank you.
And so I should also add to this that because the Buddha didn't insist on monogamy, that Buddhism has been able to adapt itself to different cultures according to the prevailing norms of those cultures. Like, for example, in Tibet, the customary practice is not polygamy. Polygamy means one man has several wives, but the opposite, polyandry, where one woman will take several husbands. Why that happened in Tibet, I don't know. I don't know enough about the culture. But that is just the customary practice. But once the woman enters into relations, takes on several husbands, then that becomes a committed relationship between that one woman and her several husbands.
Even though it involves hurting people.
It what?
Even though it involves hurting people.
It winds up?
Even though it involves hurting people.
No, it doesn't hurt the people.
Well, it does, because, I mean, if your husband is having another wife, it does have an impact.
That is true, actually. That is true.
So it does hurt.
That is true, yeah.
So maybe he just relented according to the customs, but I can't imagine that ethically he would have accepted it.
I'll have to give some thought to that. But I'm just explaining what the third precept actually prohibits.
Thank you.
I would have a comment on that. I think in a culture where it's the norm,
Yeah.
it would be less hurtful.
Yeah, in itself it would be less hurtful, but there was often a tense relationship in, say, households in which there are 2 wives, and this continued through at least through Indian culture through some time. It said like one of the most undesirable positions in life is to be the second wife in a household where there's a senior wife, because then the senior wife boss. This is the reason it becomes hurtful. It's not because of the relation between the women and the husband, but really, there's no joke in this, but because the senior wife bosses around the junior wife and makes her do the housework and maybe do the cooking and do the laundry, while the senior wife just enjoys the privileges of her superior position.
My question is a little more linguistic. Is there a translation issue? And what comes across is an absurdity in this, that an obstruction doesn't obstruct. Are there different words being used in the original?
It's actually the same, basically the same word.
Okay.
Yeah. So it seems like a contradiction. What Arita is saying is a contradiction, which is what makes me suspect that he was probably really saying something different, something more explicit, but the way it got phrased or formulated in the text, it was formulated in this way. I don't know why. In fact, if I remember now the Chinese version of the sutta, it doesn't say obstruct. It doesn't say that this monk Arita is claiming that obstructive things called obstructions by the Blessed One are not able to obstruct one who engages in them. But it puts the point more explicitly. It says sensual desires are not able to obstruct one who indulges in them.
Oh, what's the significance of Arita formally being of the vulture colors?
I have to say I don't like this because I would assume that in the Indian culture of that period, the clan of the vulture killers was almost certainly regarded as a low clan. I don't know why they're killing vultures, but it would seem to be a low clan, perhaps even one of the what would now be called the outcast clans. And so it's almost be sort of saying that implicitly that this person who is promulgating this bad view, this wrong view, comes from one of the outcast clans. Almost with the hint that we shouldn't be ordaining these outcast people as Buddhist monks because they're not able to understand the teaching correctly and they promulgate wrong views. Even though the Buddha himself, in other suttas, had said that when anybody goes forth into the homeless life, they give up their name and clan and their caste, and they all just merge together just like the rivers of the ocean. That's just like the rivers merge when they reach the ocean.
This Arita's wrong view refers exclusively to sexuality. So what the Buddha is opposed to is just sexuality for monastic people, or is his wrong view does his wrong view refer to sensual pleasures in general, in the broader sense, through the five senses?
I would say that perhaps both senses are being indicated here. That in a way, of course, the indulgence in sensual pleasures is a hindrance in the more general sense, in that it's an activation of sensual craving and of sensual desire, and so it will function as a hindrance in the development of the mind. But I think the reason why it causes such a rustling of robes in the Sangha is that he seems to be saying that it's okay for the Buddhist monks to indulge in sexual activities. In fact, the way the commentary, which is not always to be trusted, but anyway, the way the commentary tries to formulate what is the reasoning that led Arita to this conclusion. And what the commentary says is that Arita had observed that there were lay people, lay disciples of the Buddha, who achieved the stages of stream enterer and once returner, and they were still able to enjoy sensual pleasures, to engage in sexual activities. And so then Arita reflected, well, if lay people could achieve the paths and fruits, the first two stages of awakening, without having to observe celibacy, why shouldn't we as monks be able to do the same thing? Was there some other question? Okay, let's take from the back.
Really quick, I was just wondering, was Buddha against having sexual consorts?
You mean a relationship outside of marriage by a consort?
Yes, like in tantric practices.
Oh, I see. You mean in tantric, the kind. In the early teachings, I don't think one would find any way to